Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome. Bienvenidos. Bienvenuto. Welcome to all you freedom fighters and, truth seekers, migrant defenders out there who joined or are joining us this evening. I just watched the film. I'm feeling very raw. Some of you got a chance to watch the documentary last night or earlier. But I just finished watching it, and I am just so moved, and more than just moved emotionally. I'm ready to move into action. You know, this is what our purpose is in showing this film. So I just wanted to say I'm Linda Allegro, with Project Director of the New Sanctuary Network, and on behalf of all of us who are fighting for equal rights and justice and dignity for all people, I want to welcome you all to the panel tonight. I just also wanted to give a shout out and a special thanks to Circle Cinema, Chuck Foxen, for partnering with New Sanctuary to put this event together. So I'm going to stick around, maybe come back at the end to answer any questions, but really looking forward to hearing from our panelists tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the evening, who is going to introduce our panelists and take it from here. But thanks again, everybody, standing strong, standing with us tonight. I'm handing it over to Colby Webster. Thanks for being with us.
There we go. All right, so really pleased to be with everyone. I watched the film myself just 2 days ago, and I think everyone else is just taking this in or just saw it last night. And it's an incredibly phenomenal film, and I'm really glad to be able to introduce these phenomenal guests that we have to really sort out all these feelings and what's really such a monumental film. So we have with us Amanrani Perez Shamu. She's a filmmaker and activist. We have Ahimsa Timoteo Boran, an artist and organizer. We have Zania Kish, media studies professor, and Jessica Itzayana Vasquez Nesta, social media strategist and activist. So just off the bat, what stood out about the film to everybody? Where are you at? How are you feeling? I'll go ahead and throw it to you, Amarani.
Yeah, well, definitely watching that, in our work with Dream Alliance, we've been through those moments where we feel for our community very heavily. And there's a lot of activists who, at least for DAOK, most of the leadership is DACA recipients. And so every time that we step out to protest, we don't have that ability to be on the front line, but seeing the courage that Marco and the group of leaders in the film did to go into the prisons and actually do the work from the inside out, that's incredible. And it really shows that collective action. So now more than ever, with the movements that we're having, especially with our Black Lives Matters protests, and also here in Tulsa as we heighten 287G, that's the kind of action that we need. And so just very moved by watching that, for sure.
Xenia, curious, how are you feeling?
Yeah, thanks to the organizers for inviting us and bringing this conversation together. It's a really powerful film to watch and to be watching at this particular moment. I don't know if this was an intentional planning point for the committee, but today is the 8th anniversary of Obama declaring DACA on June 15th in 2012. And it's an interesting and poignant moment that the Supreme Court is revisiting the validity. The Trump administration is bringing challenges to whether DACA can stand, whether it's constitutional or not, and that decision might come down this week too. So it's a moment that we need to be reflecting on the politics of the big order questions, of the legal implications of DACA and all of the other immigration issues that we're facing. But this film is also so powerful because it puts those large structural questions into very personal stories and makes it very accessible to a wide audience for whom the immigrant population, and particularly particularly the undocumented population, may seem sort of homogenous through our mainstream media coverage, where there might not be a strong sense of who's involved, of whose lives are affected, of how larger communities are impacted. And so the power of these individual stories really comes through, as well as how broad and multiracial and coalitional this movement is. And that's one of the things that makes it so strong.
And Jessica?
Yeah, so very powerful film. I actually had to watch it in pieces because it just, the topics and everything that they talked about, I could see my family, I could see my community reflected in their stories and their experiences. But I think I had two main takeaways from watching the film. And I think my first takeaway was that the detention and deportation system is not about justice. It's not about justice. It's never been about justice. It's about profit. And I think it's important that in the producers, and Michael specifically, uses warehouse to describe how the detainees are being held. And I think that's very important to point out that they are being warehoused, because the longer they're held in detention and as long as they're filling up a bed, there's a company out there that's profiting off of their detention and eventual deportation. In this instance, it's the GEO group, which if you see on their name badges, they all had the GEO logo. That's the official logo. That's a real company that is currently right now profiting off of detention. And, you know, quite frankly, they're profiting off of trauma. They're separating our families, and a lot of times without justification. You heard them say over and over again how some of the detainees had not even received a day before the court. So how like, yeah, it's not about justice. The deportation and detention system is not about justice, and at large, the detention and incarceration system in the United States is not about justice. It's about profit. But my second takeaway is that there is power in unity. You saw that the power really happened when there were numbers behind the hunger strike, and when there were numbers behind the petitions, and when there was number behind any number of action. There's unity and there's power in unity. And it's not just Latino unity, it's intersectional unity, because we are more than just one identity. We're not just immigrants. We all have a number of experiences that we live off of. So yeah, there's power in unity.
And Ahimsa?
It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank not only the organizers who are part of this and the other panelists, and also definitely within that not only Circle Cinema, but definitely Linda Allegro, New Sanctuary Network Tulsa, and then also Dan Allen Center for Social Justice, who are community partners for this event. And I think I also just want to definitely thank the filmmakers, Alex Rivera and Cristina Ibarra, for creating this film, and all the teams who are part of working on this beyond those two people. I also want to thank Melinda Mateo Galindo of Atomic Culture, as well as Black Horse Low, who screened this at the drive-in theater here in town back in September. So that's when I first saw this, was then. So I want to thank them for their work as filmmakers, cultural producers, advocates in so many different ways, and centering so many other folks' voices, Native, Latinx, and so many other multiply intersecting oppressed communities. So for me, like, while we definitely could talk filmically about this, cinematically, about what were the elements, like for me, I was really drawn to definitely various filmic aspects of, you know, these blurry moments where you're like, okay, is this being recreated? Is this something happening live? Also, like, the dangers and beauty, like, of, and the radicalness of filming from the inside, as well as also reconstructing outside, the tremendous advocacy work and allyship work, real allyship work, embodied in very physically challenging ways of doing this work. I want to, like, flip immediately, since I know that's part of our focus line is about call to action, is like, how can people who've watched this film or thinking about undocumented loved ones, period, do things. So I want to start off there, and we'll come back throughout the night between all of us. The first thing is, I think people often think, and this is a time of heavy lifting with both the coronavirus pandemic, Black Lives Matters, movements for ending violence against Black communities, and ensuring racial equality in this time of entrenched white supremacy that has been going on for centuries here on this land, and all the different targeting of our multiple intersecting communities. Is I think a lot of people are like, how can I add something more to their life? Or how can I add another community commitment if they're not already doing this work? And I think oftentimes that's like creating a false binary between one's currently existing life and supposedly this other community or this other social justice work that they're supposed to do. And for me, what people can do when they're thinking about any oppressed community is, how is that community already a part of your life? You know, who are the people in your life that you may or may not know? It's almost like being, you know, any of the different identities that people need to be thinking about intersectionally. You know, as someone who's queer and trans, like, you may not know all the queer and trans folk in your life. You may not know all the undocumented people in your life. So to begin to, like, you know, think about who is in your life that is already out to you as undocumented, who are the people who are probably in your communities that maybe have not shared that with you, maybe due to issues of safety. And then within that, committing to a process of thinking about where are undocumented people all throughout our universe, you know, in all aspects of our lives. How can you become more informed about that? How can you self-educate? How can you center and amplify those undocumented voices in your business environments, in your educational environments, your artistic, your local community, your families, whoever that might be? Because it's not this additional thing. Undocumented people and undocumented movement is already a part of your life. You may just not already be aware of it, or not knowing how to radicalize or activate around it. So it's knowing that this is already here in Tulsa, in Oklahoma, in our lives. Undocumented people are doing amazing things anywhere. So that would be the first thing, is recognizing this is already a part of your life. You're just wanting to become more activists around it. And the second thing within that is to think about, you know, what are the different things of projects that you could do that don't always have to be, which industry protest is important, but it could be anything: multimedia work, artistic work, educational work, community, dialogues with your family, like dialogue with people that you politically disagree with. Like, there are all these different ways that we can talk about later, but it doesn't mean that if you've never done in the street organizing that that's your way. If you're an artist, you know, like, you can be supporting undocumented artists. If you are working in the sciences, can you create employment policies that support undocumented people working in the sciences? You know, are you working in educational environments? Have you done anything, or you're a parent who has children in school, have you done anything to make sure those educational environments are safe for undocumented children, undocumented students? So it's already like taking that lens into whatever work you're already doing.
I really appreciate those thoughts, Ahimsa. It really is something to consider, that, you know, whatever community you find yourself in, or wherever your commute intersects with other people's lives, you know, there are people around you who are experiencing life completely different from you. And it's really important that, you know, this being a call to action, that, you know, we approach people where they are, you know. And I want to speak back to another thought that you said about speaking about this film through its cinematic language, and how phenomenal it is that this is this hybrid cinema of documentary and dramatization. And it's interesting to me how it's this blending of medias, but also it's particularly inclusive. I have this question for you all about how these events may have happened, how they did happen under the Obama administration, how different they might be under the Trump administration, and how we might think about it differently now through this Black Lives Matter moment. You know, I see the Haitian and the Congolese immigrants that are being detained, and, you know, it's not often that us as Black folks really think about immigration as a personal issue, but it really is this very
It looks like he froze a little bit.
I'll type a quick
Let's
note
see.
to him.
Wow.
Some technical difficulties.
Hey, Colby, can you hear us? He froze on us for a bit.
Jessica, would you like to continue for a bit until Colby's back in?
Yeah, I think I got his question while he joins us back. He asked how we would view this in different lenses. It happened during the Obama administration. What would it look like under the Trump administration, and how would we see it now? Oh, I think he's rejoining us here in a bit. Under the Black Lives Matter movement. And I guess I'll just take it from the top. I think a lot of people, we do forget that under the Obama administration, we had the peak number of deportations in a year. And the Obama administration was a difficult time for a lot of immigrants. There were a lot of successes, like I'm not gonna hate that. You know, Xenia mentioned DACA is at the 8th anniversary today. But looking at it under the Trump administration, I would definitely say that the risk would be a lot higher. At the end of the film, we hear Marco say that he's more cautious now, and I don't want to take that away from him, because he's definitely still a very radical, very unapologetic, and you know, he's still one of our leaders in the movement. So I don't want to say that he's any more shy under the Trump administration. But there is no denying that the Trump administration has made significant changes in the immigration system, in the legal immigration system, and in the deportation process. It's sped up a lot of deportations. And we know that even individuals who were previously safe from deportations are not as safe anymore. One of the communities that we talked about are DACA recipients. And under the Obama administration, there were deportations of younger individuals, but not nearly as often as they're happening now with the current administration. So there is that just elevated risk because his view on immigration is just completely different. But then moving on to our current movement for Black lives and defending Black lives. I think, well, first off, I don't want to equate the two, because the fear of being deported is definitely not the same as the fear of dying at the hands of police. And so I don't want to equate the two. But I think if we zoom out from those systems, we can definitely see that there are similarities. Hey, Colby, you're back. Yay. If we zoom out from the systems, there are definitely similarities. And we know that a lot of the immigrants who end up in ICE detention went through the criminal justice system first. And there is no denying who gets arrested and detained more under the criminal justice system, and that is Black and brown bodies. And we know through deportations, Black immigrants are more likely to be detained and deported. So I think these movements, they really go hand in hand, because it is about liberating our people. It's about freedom. It's about dismantling these systems of oppression and dismantling these systems of white supremacy that have oppressed us for so long. And just thinking about the immigration movement, within itself, I know a lot of us are fighting for, immigrant rights, but if we look down the road, citizenship isn't going to get us freedom. People with citizenship are still criminalized. We know this, we see this. So citizenship is not the end goal. The end goal is freedom and liberation from these oppressive systems. So in that, I do think that these two movements are hand in hand, and we're all fighting for the liberation of our community.
Amrani?
Yeah, say it again, Jessica, for the people in the back. Ooh, yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I just, in freedom, I'm still stuck on how powerful that was. But you know, as Colby was saying, how is this different now that we have Trump administration? And I think how openly the oppression is right now. I mean, you see viral images of children outside in detention centers, and you see those images of the foil sheets and the aluminum blankets. And you think that, you know, having children in detention centers, you know, would be appalling, but it's still quiet. And now as we, you know, move through like the Black Matters movement and so much genocide of just like Black and brown people, and it's just, you know, it's out there in the open. And now that we have, you know, a growing movement of our Black community that is so enraged and is willing to go out there and put their bodies on the line to, you know, make a statement to our governments that our, you know, our protection, just as Jessica was saying, even with citizenship, it doesn't guarantee you anything. You're still oppressed. You're still under those barriers of colorism and just racism and discrimination. And, you know, those are the concepts and just the chains that have like tied us down as people. And in seeing a lot of the film, you know, all of that is out there in the open. And we have detention centers, and we have children in detention centers, and it's incredible, you know, how silent people are. And as we're like talking about the movement, silence equaling death, that's pretty much it. And if we aren't vocal about it, especially with our undocumented community that doesn't have the power to vote, doesn't have the right, and doesn't feel empowered to, you know, step into that freedom. I was watching the film, and there was a moment where I remembered how freeing it was to finally tell somebody that I was undocumented, because for so long you just have to lie about it. You have to lie about it because you're under this fear. And as an advocate, as somebody that has, you know, is able to stand up for my community and no longer has that fear, I feel for my community that feels like they don't have a voice. And so right now, through this administration, it's even more time to say something and to stand up, not just for yourself, but for your community.
Xenia?
Very powerful reflections so far. And I think it's true that raw numbers of deportations under Obama were higher than they are now, but numbers of people detained under Trump are higher. And those are the conditions that are continue to be extremely dangerous for everybody, especially amplified under COVID. And I think that one of the things we need to pay close attention to now, and that both movements draw our attention to, both Black Lives Matter and Immigrant Rights and Youth Alliance and all of these different groups that we're looking at, they're drawing attention to our state-sanctioned organized forms of violence against vulnerable communities, against communities of color, against immigrant communities, against communities without documents. And those are parallel fights. They're not exactly the same fight, but they're coming to a head right now. And the violence that has been increased under CPB, not beginning with Trump at all, but has really been amplified and given sort of free rein in this moment is of importance to all of our communities. So one of the interesting things that the activists in the film were able to do was to really call out in that moment of the waning of the first of Obama's first administration and point out and say, look, what you're doing doesn't match up with your liberal rhetoric saying that you value immigrants and that you value the Latinx community and you value and want our vote. And so they found that gap between rhetoric and action, and they drove a wedge into it. And they were very, very powerful in their activism in taking advantage of that for political gain. And we have an administration now which has no shame. And so that those same tactics won't work in the same way necessarily, not at the federal level. We can pressure and continue to pressure all kinds of other levels of politicians, but it's both the Black Lives Matter and the immigrant rights movements or immigrant liberation movements, more accurately, are constantly adapting and changing tactics. And that's what we need to keep doing. And so that vibrant imagination of constantly thinking about what else can we try, what else can we do is so important. And another way that these groups can learn from each other. So on the one hand, we see Black Lives Matter directly and very clearly and publicly bringing out all of the violations of our police forces, and the unjust and uneven policing of different bodies in our society, and what impact that has. We also see at the same time Customs and Border Patrol not being held to the same level of public scrutiny. There's just not that same public visibility of the corruption, of the violence that's being done, because so much of it is being done behind these walls where no one can take cell phone videos, where no one can go and record. And so we even see at the level of the Democrats right now, last week released a bill, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, trying to respond to current movements, and they're trying to bring greater accountability to local and state level police. But CBP and the other federal agencies are not at all considered under this bill, and not being brought under greater accountability, not being questioned for their qualified immunity, and not being brought under any form of accountability when people's constitutional rights are violated, whether that's in detention or outside of detention by ICE, by Customs and Border Patrol. So these are really big issues that face both communities and face both movements, and that's really important. And as Ahim says, Jessica, as everyone has brought up, the intersectional strength of these movements is so powerful right now in this moment, and that really lends to the strength and flexibility and adaptability of these movements. And so I'll just finish up by pointing to a terrific model that's developed by the scholar Kevin Escudero, who works with a lot of undocumented youth activists. And he points out that one of the things that has made the youth activist community so strong is that they're able to mobilize community knowledge sharing practices. So really being in touch with and very connected to and drawing from local communities and their knowledge base and their networks. Also the strategic leveraging of intersectional identities, so drawing people in and speaking to those multiple dimensions of our identity. No one is the single level of identity. You're not just a person defined by your legal or immigration status. And then the high stakes allyship, so that driving that activism into high stakes areas and demanding more of allies, asking for the things that everybody can do depending on where they're positioned and what they can offer. And I think that those are two ways that both movements are so effective in this moment.
It's great insight. Ahimsa?
Thank you. For me, I'm going to respond in two different ways. One is as someone who's from New York and from a multiracial family, and that is increasingly more multiracial each generation, going back centuries, and for whom my family's future is Black. It's as equally, when I'm looking at my grandniece and grandnephews, this family, my family, is as Black, as is Asian, as is Native, as is Latinx, as is Arab, as is white. We are a very mixed family that's been based on the East Coast for generations. And so for me, coming from that reality of a very multi-generational multiraciality within my family, and also just not even just my family, so many New York families. For me, when I first moved to the West Coast, even though I was aware of different realities and different Latinx communities, I was sort of when people were talking about divisions between Black and Latinx communities as if they were two separate communities, that kind of blew my mind, because I was like, wait, it's the same community, because the majority of Latinx folk back home and our families are of African descent, and the majority of Black folk are from a wide variety of places in the world, because New York City is a mix of African American communities, African Caribbean, African Latinx, African Continental, North African, and those communities mix and live with each other. Not saying it's always perfect, but the history of that multi-Black reality in New York, multi-African reality, I think creates a different kind of context when people are thinking about immigration. Because I think for a lot of folk back home in New York, people do see it as an issue, and do understand that there are undocumented Black folk within the US and are thinking about these things intersectionally. So I think something that folk in Tulsa and Oklahoma can do is get keyed into those conversations elsewhere. Who are the Black undocumented folk who are leading movements in New York, around the US, and in other multiple countries where there's undocumented situations in multiple countries. And to really be thinking about, again, breaking down these false binaries where we think this is supposedly not us, whoever we're defining us in that moment. And just like people are doing work around Black trans lives right now, looking at how Black trans lives matter, looking at how Black undocumented lives matter, and to be looking at these intersections and saying, are we centering Black undocumented folk in our organizing? And if not, how do we need to do that? How can we amplify those voices? The other thing I would say, and I'll talk about super brief, is we also need to acknowledge, I think at this historical moment, in terms of 2020, the elections coming up. And we need to acknowledge how white supremacy and xenophobia are embedded in the governmental structure of the US, while it simultaneously deploys racist myths of us all supposedly being equal and all supposedly being immigrants. So denial of indigeneity, a denial of African enslavement, denial of refugees, a denial of also forced migration, and colonial engulfment of various territories into the Caribbean, into the Pacific, across Turtle Island, in so many parts of the world. And so I think we need to be thinking across our multiple legal statuses around how to mobilize for this election. Because whether we have the legal status to vote in this country or not, this election matters. And just like everyone needs to be banding together and supporting undocumented folk, we all need to be banding together and mobilizing in terms of this election. I don't believe electoral politics are everything, but I think this is one of the most important elections that we have, and not just on the presidential, but the Senate, the House, state, local elections. I think we need to really be I can't think of the name, but a school board. A school board is a primary site for getting into the political system. Do you know what I'm saying? So all the little elections matter. And I think really committing to supporting Black progressive candidates and undocumented candidates that are intersectionally committed to all of our communities, and thinking how are we going to be mobilizing in the coming months? Because with what's coming now, postponed one day from Juneteenth to the following day, with the person in the orange house coming here, we need to be really mindful of that things might not only be intensifying locally here again, even though it's not stopped, but also it's going to be maybe intensifying over the coming months. So how do we sustain that long term up to the election, during the election, and post-election?
So I'm going to glaze over a few questions that definitely note some important dialogue from the film. They mentioned in the film that Customs and Border Patrol is twice the size of the FBI and the largest law enforcement agency in the world. And then you pair that with the consistent brutality of Black folks, and people of color altogether by local police departments. And you all made some great points about how we're working towards freedom, but it's wild how there's this setback when it comes to just having papers to be able to just get a taste of what freedom could be. And there's just with the fear to vote and concerns with privacy. The census is going on right now, and with COVID, that might just borderline be out the window. But it's so important that we all fill it out so that we can get more funding to improve our neighborhoods, something that which is a position we've all been put in due to racist federal policy. So back to Zinya's comment about how successful this movement was, or this organization was, in creating a wedge between rhetoric and action, and how that may have been more successful in the past, but now we have an administration with no shame. So going forward, what do you all believe is the most effective way of advocating moving through this incredibly aggressive and very strategic administration? Because I think we all know that it's highly unlikely that the Tulsa Juneteenth or the Juneteenth date wasn't by happenstance or an accident. And even if it was by an accident, that's just as telling, you know? So how do we drive that wedge between just outright aggressive and ignorant administration and powers that be? Throw it to Jessica.
So when I heard that on the movie that CBP and ICE have like a greater budget than the FBI, I was like, I've read a story on that, and so I went and looked it up, and I didn't read this out loud because otherwise the ICE CBP budget is greater than the combined budgets of the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, Secret Service, and U.S. Marshals. So that's like a number of alphabet soup law enforcement agencies, and ICE and CBP are still like up ahead. That's wild. The fact that that agency has just grown as much as it has, and the fact that ICE was not around like before 2001. It was created after 9/11, but I think a lot of people assume that ICE has always been around, and it hasn't. It's a new agency, and it's been growing out of control. And the story that I read, it's a really great story by, I believe it's Politico. It's called The Green Monster. It's very easy to Google, and it's about CBP and how it has just grown since it was created. And as it has grown, the corrupt and abuse that's happening inside has also skyrocketed. Between another fun fact, not fun fact, between 2005 and 2012, nearly every day a CBP and ICE agent was arrested for criminal wrongdoing. Between 2005 and 2012, every day, almost every day, a CBP or ICE agent was arrested for criminal wrongdoing. The fact that that agency has just skyrocketed the way it has, and that it hasn't received the scrutiny, as Anya was saying, like it's just kind of like, oh, well, they're illegal aliens, so they're not humans, is the subwriting. So it's okay that they are criminalized and detained and deported the way they are. And it's wild that that is a thing that happens, and that it continues to happen. So I hope it does get a little bit more attention, how this agency has just grown and how the abuses that they're committing, like I can't keep track of them. I feel like every time I get on Facebook, I see a new abuse by an ICE or Border Patrol agent, and it's just out of control. But to answer your question on how we continue to advocate in the future, I think my one point to any activist, and I'm not a seasoned activist myself. I've only been around for less than 10 years. But what I would say is we can't have fear. We can't have fear. Like, there's just no way around it. I know it's scary. I know it's a difficult time, but our fear and our quietness and our living in the shadows is what has allowed the government to continue to oppress us. And the longer we're quiet and the longer we hold on to the fear, the more we're going to be oppressed and the farther we are going to be away from liberation. And it's something that I have to constantly remind myself, because living under this administration is not easy for anyone. But I think we just have to remind ourselves that we can't be afraid, because when we're afraid, that's used against us.
Amarani?
Yeah, well, going a little bit on to just how CBP and just immigration methods to, like, in detention centers have grown. Now they have things like ice boxes or hieleras, where it's low temperatures, and they're keeping children in these like just very cold holding cells. And when it comes to seeing images of kids in cages or all of that, the methods that in which, like, they're putting our people under have just been enhanced so much. And when it comes to inhumanity and just all of these systems that they're using against us, we have to combat that with pressure. And as it is inhumane to, hold people simply for not having documentation, like with the 287G contract and the IGSAs that we have here, where they don't even allow people to go out on a bail. They keep them on holds for simple things like traffic violations, or just simple things. We're not allowed to have mistakes. And yeah, just it's hard. We have to get out into the streets and really combat all of these violent forces with more humanity and more bodies, to just allow people to remember that as much as they continue to just brutalize our people in these detention centers, in these with these like inhumane forms of punishment and just torture. It's time to just call it out. And I'm just hearing the numbers that Jessica was throwing out. That's definitely it's appalling, and it should raise questions as to what's going on. And I know that those articles just recently came out where they were talking about how ICE had lost like 3,000 more children in detention, and nobody's questioning it. We just, it's a time for us to join in intersections and really in looking at the prison complex and just all of these systems in our community that are not working. We have to get out into the streets, and we really have to make direct action and protest it and not just allow it to happen. So.
Xenia?
Hey, Colby, can I jump in really quick? I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
I saw that Judith commented that article that I was talking about in Politico about the green monster. And yeah, it was from 2005 to 2012. That's where I got that data fact from on the ICE and CBP agents. And then just something else about Judith Huerta. She was actually involved in the Claudio Rojas campaign. Judith Huerta is my friend from Oklahoma City. And she's actually one of the reasons that I got into organizing in the first place. And when you talk about living without fear, like, let's talk about Judith. She was one of the individuals that was arrested in a Florida office, like for civil disobedience before DACA. So this was one of the individuals who risked deportation to bring attention to Claudio Rojas's case. And it's an honor to organize with Judith. Thank you for popping in, Judith. And it, again, just shows that when we shed that fear, or when we turn that fear, we can turn the fear into our armor, and we can use that as something that we are using it to fight instead of something that we're cowering behind or something that we're hiding behind. So thanks, Judith, for dropping in and dropping that link.
Just wanted to make a quick comment and saying that the 3,000 kids in, and then to go on about ice boxes, like I just have to say that I was talking to somebody today about, the genocide of Black people in America. And I just don't think that this at all can be overstated, or understated as anything but, genocide happening in America. And it is really something that it takes so much courage and such an erasure of fear to address what is clearly wrong. But I just had to sit with what you were saying for a moment, and wow. But Xenia, please, thoughts?
So back to the original question, the issue of Customs and Border Patrol is one that we really need to do everything we can to rein in. This is an extremely powerful, highly militarized, extremely well-funded, as those numbers attest, organization that it's become even a supranational organization. I'm Canadian, so I can't actually vote in these upcoming elections, but as ever since I vote at all levels. But it's recently, Customs and Border Patrol has reached an agreement with the Canadian government to allow CBP officers to detain people on Canadian soil. So in Canadian airports, when people come to travel to the US within Canada, they're able to detain Canadians on Canadian soil. So this is an agency that has murdered dozens of individuals since 2010 alone. Officers are almost never held accountable. They are protected. They are protected under multiple levels of legal immunity, and are able to seemingly freely cross people's constitutional rights without any accountability. So that's something that we need to keep pushing for and make that more visible and bring that into the wider public conversation, because so many people have the privilege of not having to learn about this or know about it. And that's something that many of you are asking in the comments, like, what else can I do locally? And I think Ahimsa and Jessica and Marani, everyone's been giving a lot of great ideas. Another thing you can think about doing is really pressuring your local media outlets. How much are they covering these issues? It affects all of our communities. And how much are you learning? How much are your media organizations giving voice to these local communities, to the activists who are doing this work? How much are they spotlighting and highlighting how our communities are impacted by deportations, by the menace of police violence, of ICE violence, and so forth. Another thing everyone should be thinking about is how much our broader economy is dependent upon immigrant labor, documented and undocumented. So once we look at where the majority of COVID hotspots are, jails, prisons, increasingly ICE detention centers, meatpacking plants, which have been declared essential businesses by Trump, are being forced to run under very dangerous circumstances. And the populations who are put at the front lines and made most vulnerable are majority immigrant populations. In some of those places in Oklahoma, locally, Guyman, Oklahoma, and Western Oklahoma, majority Latinx population working at the meatpacking plant there, major hotspot. Just east of us in Arkansas, we have a lot of chicken processing plants where there are also a lot of outbreaks. There are rumors that Trump may be on the verge of declaring also essential fruit and produce pickers because they're starting to be outbreaks within worker camps. And there are fears about interruption of our other areas of our food supply chain. So this is something that we are all implicated in. The chicken that we buy, we need to go back to those companies and hold them accountable. We have all of these corporations coming out and now proudly saying Black Lives Matter to us, we care. But those tend to be often hollow PR declarations. And so this is a moment to come and say, as citizens, and also as people participating in this unjust economic system that depends on this labor and exploits this labor and makes it vulnerable, that we need to demand more and better of all of these organizations around us. So those are a few more ideas just to throw into the mix to these already wonderful ideas that are being circulated.
And Ahimsa.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief because I know we also have other questions that we've scheduled for tonight, because questions circulated before the discussion, and then also there's questions from audience as well. So I'll mention my brief, even though we could talk more. Going back to what I was talking about earlier about deconstructing like false binaries and thinking about how recognizing the ways in which undocumented people are woven to every aspect of our lives, and to then be thinking about activating those already pre-existing areas of our lives, this for me is a given, but I don't know how people racialize undocumented status in their consciousness here. I've only been in Oklahoma for about a year and a half, but like are undocumented people in every racial, ethnic group. There are undocumented people with every intersection of identity. So there are undocumented white people in the US. There are undocumented Asian folk. There are undocumented indigenous folk, indigenous and immigrant, or indigenous and refugee, or indigenous and migrant are not separate mutually existing categories. So just like we talked about Black undocumented folk, people need to be recognizing that, and there's different kinds of privilegings within that. White folk who are undocumented in the US, whether they came here as students, whether they just crossed the border, whatever their set of situations are, born to children, just like other undocumented people are born in the US to people who are undocumented parents. So just like there are multiple privileges that might exist for that kind of undocumented reality, people need to be thinking about that this is a part that this reality, this beautiful, loving reality of undocumented people is a part of our communities, and to then do the work there about thinking about what that means and how do you love your people fully and how do you then do that work. So that's maybe more of an abstract take on this rather than the numbers and the enforcement and all the multiple atrocities that are happening under this administration and were happening prior. But I think concretizing it in that way can be a way of thinking about not just how do we look at these massive budgets tied to border and customs, but how do we localize it in ways? And there are ways that everyone every day can be centering and amplifying undocumented voices.
And so we have some questions from the audience as well. So what policy change is a priority during this election period to enable freedom from fear of deportation as a first step towards citizenship and the final equal treatment in society? Let everybody consider the question just for a moment. And if anyone wants to go ahead and chime in, you're more than welcome to start.
I could speak on that. We need a pathway towards citizenship for a lot of the undocumented community. That's kind of the first step in that. And it's not just for some, because what's been happening a lot with the DREAM Act is that a lot of the Republican senators are giving us, they're going to give us a pathway towards citizenship or a temporary work authorization card, but they're going to enhance CBP. They're going to strengthen Homeland Security to the point where they're not going to be coming for us anymore, but they're going to be coming for our parents, and sacrificing one part of the community for, the betterment of us, of the so-called dreamers. That's not the kind of legislation that we need. And in this entire discussion of just how do we combat this, we need legislation that's going to apply for everybody, that's going to give everybody an opportunity, especially when they're undocumented, not just halfway. And so it's just like the double-edged sword with DACA. Right now we're waiting on a decision from the Supreme Court, but DACA was never permanent. And so now we're at a turning point where our senators can really introduce something, and us as activists, we can really advocate for something that's for the community, not just for some.
I'll jump in quickly. I think that's really true. Those are paths to citizenship is #1 priority in a clear and important way. Another thing that's going on right now is the virtual suspension of asylum processing. So the Trump administration has been trying during its entire period in office to shrink and narrow the opening for people to claim asylum to this country and reduce refugees to the country as much as possible. And now in the last few months, under pandemic conditions, they've drawn on a very old 75-year-old quarantine law to essentially stop even considering or giving due process to anyone claiming asylum. And so anybody arriving at the border and claiming asylum in the last few months has been turned away. Tens of thousands of people have been turned away at the border without any due processing or recognition of very valid and important asylum claims. And that's returning people back to places of extreme violence and persecution in many cases. So our asylum system needs an entire revamp as well and needs to be made much more robust. So that's another policy change that's really important. Another interesting thing that we need to be paying attention to right now, and this is especially important if, God help us, Trump is elected back in, is that one of the things, unfortunately, I don't know if anyone's followed along, but Claudia Rojas, the main character featured in this film, ended up being removed from detention and returned to his family for 7 years. And then a year ago, he went for his annual ICE check-in and was detained and actually deported a year ago back to Argentina. So just over a year ago, he was deported. And one of the reasons he was targeted is that the Trump administration has increasingly come after immigrants who are critical of the administration. And so there is increasing speech-based persecution. And so people are increasingly trying to make a fight on the basis of the First Amendment, that people should not be at all persecuted or targeted because of their speech, because they appear in a documentary, because they go to a protest. But that is something that's happening now, and that's a policy that also needs to be addressed and combated by all means necessary.
I think I can just jump in like super quickly, and Zinnia can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but if we have a different president come in, I think the immediate action that can happen is to undo a lot of the executive orders and just like memos that that the administration put in place, because they don't have to go through Congress. And that's how we've seen them make really devastating changes to the immigration system, is through executive orders. Executive orders like DACA, the good thing about them, the good/bad thing about them, is they can be overturned right away, as we're seeing now with DACA. It's going through the court trying to be overturned. So that's one positive thing. But that is, of course, assuming that we have a different administration in the office.
And just a very quick add-on, one of the things that's so powerful about this film is that it shows the cruelty of the system that's embedded in how much individual discretion is available at all levels. So that was something, a flexibility that could sometimes be used to the benefit of individuals, as we saw these activists mobilizing, but it also shows that now there's no protection and there's no consistency, because because an administration that is bent on not hearing these claims has discretion at all levels to shut them all down. So there just needs to be much stronger regulatory, long-term, permanent legal protections, such that it's not just at the whim of changing administrations and how they feel.
If we could let Ahimsa speak on the question beforehand.
Cool. You know, like, I don't always retain all the information. And so for me, like, one of the things I do is I have my bookmarks. I have things summarized. I go to certain people. So there have been multiple candidates who are running for the Democratic presidential primary that I supported in different ways because I wanted to have a robust dialogue. And one of them was Julian Castro. And Julian Castro has done a lot of work, just like any other good politician doing that work. I want to be clear that he's not the only one. And I just went to his website and was looking at what he had listed there. And I'm going to share internally here the link, and maybe that link could be shared on the Chiron and stuff. So I'm just going to summarize some of the things that are on his website right now that are very specific. So I'm not going to claim all my brilliance for remembering all these, even though these are things that were said that I've heard and known about and been doing work around. Family reunification is one policy area. There's a huge backlog of cases that needs to, there's been a bureaucratic delay, and like we need to be looking at these cases. There are various things tied to orphans, widows, widowers, stepchildren. Also, they mention on the website here, LGBT families. Like, we had a major Supreme Court victory today where in the US, the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision banned employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That's huge, because not only in Oklahoma did we not have those protections in terms of LGBT folk, in terms of employment, but the majority of states you could be fired for being queer and trans prior to the Supreme Court decision. So within that, what about binational queer and trans couples and families? Also on Julian's website about the importance of removing the Muslim ban, the refugee ban, also deported veterans who served in US Armed Forces. I'm just looking at some of the bullet points that I've been familiar with as we've been doing work on this over the years, but just to highlight some of the things that are just on one website that people can become informed by, and there's so many others. And the other thing that I don't see, I don't think listed here, but something I'm familiar with as a survivor and anti-violence activist, is the Violence Against Women Act. And the Violence Against Women Act, which even though it has women in the title, protects all of us in a variety of different ways, always is something that has to be renewed. And always the LGBT provisions of that always the immigrant provisions, always the things dealing with complex realities of Native women who are often caught between state, federal, and tribal laws, depending upon where perpetration occurs, between who that perpetrator is and the loopholes that unfortunately exist. And Native women and Native folk have the most epidemic rates of sexual assault and domestic violence. So within that, we need to be looking at all these things similarly with the Violence Against Women Act. There are immigrant and refugee provisions that have to be renewed each year or tied to that. So in almost any area of policy that people are committed to, any social justice issue, there's going to be undocumented issues within that. And while I mentioned just this one link on Julian Castro's thing, there are multiple resources online people can find to educate themselves about the multiple policy issues that we need to work around.
And just a quick ad, be sure to vote. Be sure to be hyper local and see who your candidates are for Congress. We have our own state Congress, which I more or less learned the ins and outs of today. So there's a lot that we can do in the next few days or next few weeks to help us all in these incremental steps to a much better, more robust, broader picture that is inclusive and helpful to all. So I just can't not say that, but please continue.
I'm going to ask a question while we're reading and taking in that question, because I'm uninformed and I want to be more informed. So I know one of the things in terms of the Black Lives Matters movement is there are various bail funds that exist for folk. Some are also community specific, such as Black trans protesters having bail funds and other kinds of funding situations to support Black protesters and other protesters doing mobilization work right now. Do people know of undocumented people bail funds or not bail funds, if that's exactly the way, but like just different things that could be helping not only on an economic level, but on legal levels or other things that people might want to share right now. So I just wanted to mention that.
Is Linda still here? Does she maybe have some insight?
Well, what I would say to that is that unfortunately, bail is, first of all, if you're on an ICE hold, you're not eligible to be bonded out or to post bail. And in the few cases where that might be an option, they're usually set at $5,000 and $7,000 and $10,000, $15,000. I mean, they're completely out of reach, So it is very difficult to I mean, here locally, we've talked about setting up a bond fund through Mimi Martin's work at the TU Law School, just to have some money at hand so that if there are a few cases where we might be able to bond people out, that's an option. But I wasn't sure if the question was really revolving around the protesters who, because I'm seeing Rosa Hernandez's post about what to do. Is a bond fund available for undocumented immigrants who might be arrested during a protest? Unfortunately, no. We don't have that money, although there are a few lawyers that have stepped up and are offering kind of pro bono work to be able to defend immigrants who might be arrested during these protests. I think what I took away from the film, though, is, and I thought the message was very clear from the beginning: have a plan. If you are undocumented and you're going to a protest, talk to your people, think it through. Look at your networks. Don't just randomly go out there, but you have to take the additional precautions. And I would say that would be one step, the first step in any kind of advice. Think it through and have a plan.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not an attorney, so I'm just going to second what Linda said. To have a plan, that's like, first off, very important. And then I'm just going to emphasize because I am an undocumented person. I'm a DACA person, but technically still undocumented. We can't be afraid. Yes, we know the police is going to be out there. Yes, we know that ICE has been, and Border Patrol has been spotted at protests in the DC area and in the Texas area. But I personally try to hold on to the small amount of hope that I have left. But we have to be hopeful and we have to be courageous. And I just want to remind our undocumented and documented friends that demonstrating and getting arrested is what got us DACA. It's what got Claudio Rojas out of jail. And so we can't be afraid of getting arrested, and we can't be afraid of even getting deported. And I say that as a, I know I have a certain amount of privilege from my family, and even having DACA, like I know that affords me a lot of privilege. But yeah, we can't be afraid. I mean, we're not going to have DACA forever. DACA doesn't define us. Our citizenship doesn't define us. So I'm not going to tell you to go out there and protest, of course, and I'm not an attorney, I will remind you. But civil disobedience and this protest stuff is what got us the few wins that we have accomplished.
Also something, and forgive me for speaking out of turn earlier, like, I've been wanting to prioritize more local folk, but something was in my mind, and I think it is something that exists as a potential option, but like what do we do prior to that moment that we can like be strategic? And that way I just want to share one thing was like, for me coming up on the East and West Coast, the way we were trained to do organizing is having the most vulnerable people, whatever you define vulnerable in that moment. It could be transgender folk, it could be people of color, it could be people with disabilities, it could be women, it could be undocumented folk, it could be elders, it could be children, at the center of a mobilizing mass moving through physical space. And that the people who are more privileged, whether they're white, whether they're male, whether they're straight, whether they have legal status in the US, whether they don't have disabilities, whether they're more medium age range rather than the very youngest and the very oldest, to have those closer to the police and to the military for a few reasons. One, police are probably, or military are probably less likely to harm people who are privileged. Not always the case, but less likely to harm them. Two, there's going to take more effort to get at the people at the center of a mobilizing rather than at the margins, closer to the police and the military. So that's not saying what people need to do in terms of their bodies. They can make choices around their own bodies that are informed, but that's at least a collective strategy that we had done, as well as having people being trained with how to interact with police and to be trained how to interact with military, as well as having various legal teams ready, medic teams ready, all the different things, and having a plan in case one is arrested. So
does anyone have any final thoughts about their experiences and how they relate to this film and what folks can do going forward?
I just wanted to give one final thought for, some of our undocumented community that is, feeling that passion to maybe get out there. It's frightening, to sort of go out there, and especially if you're joining in on the Black Lives Matters protests and on those movements and on Trump's visit. It's frightening, and getting over that fear is the first step. I think Jessica spoke a little bit on that freedom. There is a freedom in being able to fight for our community that hasn't taken that step just yet. So if you're feeling like now is the time, I'm encouraging you. We have a network of support, and that's the first step. At least for me, when I go out there and I know that there's a possibility I might get arrested, I always just hold in the back of my head, hopefully they'll give me a warning, because it's so important for me to be out there, because I'm not just representing myself, but I'm representing all of the people that I know that can't go out and protest. So if you're feeling like you want to go out and do it, you have our support, and get informed before going out there, but don't feel like you don't have a voice. It's an intersectional issue right now. Things are just rising, everything's amplifying, whether it's immigration, whether it's the genocide of Black bodies every single day in America. So yeah, just get out there and contact one of our local organizations, and yeah, let's just come together.
I think I'd also like to share that there's multiple things people can do at this time. Some of them might be in the street protests. and some of them might be doing other kinds of mobilization at this time, and to be making informed decisions. Like just like anything in life, organizing is a skill that develops, and we have elders. We have people who are doing this work as their full-time passion in life. So if you are feeling not fully informed yet around how to make certain choices vis-a-vis yourself, or are feeling like, because oftentimes, particularly on social media and other things, even though I'm not on social media right now, but there can be this trying to out-radicalize each other kind of thing. And we don't need that right now. We do not need any additional shame. We don't need any additional things. Like if you have health issues, if you have a vulnerable person who has, immunosuppressed situation at home, and just even the fact of being around lots of people, even if you're wearing a mask and trying to social distance during protests, like if these are concerns for you, there are other ways you can give right now. Or if you are undocumented and you're concerned around your legal status, this is one way you can mobilize, but there are so many others. And just like maybe hosting protesters before or after a protest, even if you're hosting and this time of pandemic means you had set a bunch of water bottles out, or you're going to be one of the legal people that they can call, or you're going to be, preparing some music or signs, but you physically can't be there. There are so many different ways we can participate, and to recognize that all of those are equally valid while we're also trying to mobilize both in the street and outside of it. And a lot of these thoughts on this come from a lot of people with disabilities, people with health issues, who have thought really hard about how do we mobilize even if we can't be the bodies that are out there physically at the mobilization. There's still ways one can give to and support movement.
Well, I'm just going to go very quickly because Ahimsa stole my answer. But I'll just reword it and be shorter about it. I think what I would say is fearless looks different to different people. I know I talked a lot about, letting go of the fear and being courageous and not, and just letting go of that fear, really, essentially. And that can look different for a lot of people. For some, it's going out there. For Judith Huerta, it's getting, arrested without DACA and risking deportation. For some, it's telling their story, telling their friend who they've never told that they're undocumented. Being fearless just looks different for different people. So just be fearless in your own way.
Well, I certainly don't want to have the last word, so hopefully Linda and Colby have closing comments. These have all been fantastic ideas, and I don't have anything valuable to add to them except just to reinforce that people with privilege, whether that's racial privilege, whether that's, cisnormativity, other forms of privilege that work for you in these public spaces, need to do a lot of learning right now and need to really be supportive, but also learn not to co-opt, not to take advantage of this situation, and to follow the lead of folks who have been doing this work for a very long time, and really learn and do what is useful to those organizations that have taken this leadership. And just as a point of hope and something to look forward to, Alex, the co-director of the film, I just heard him in an interview, and he said the project that he's working on right now sounds amazing. He wouldn't name any specifics, but he's developing a film on a Latino superhero who is a vigilante anti-ICE activist. And so that's something to look forward to. And we need to remember that we need to build new stories. We are creating these new stories in this moment, and that's really important. And as Ahimsa especially noted at the beginning, art and creative expression is part of this movement. And so let's keep building new stories.
I just want to close with building a little bit on what Xenia just said, to say, let's be bold. Let's, so when people are talking about being fearless in all the different ways that we can be fearless, let's also be really bold in our reimagining of what we can be. Let's really envision a society that is really equal and just and fair. Let's really envision a society that has community care at the center of the way in which it operates, and is not premised on this model of constant punishment. Let's start to say it and speak it and live it. And so when we talk about defunding the police, when we talk about abolishing ICE, let's say it with the conviction that it deserves, and not being intimidated like somehow we're like these fluky, radicals. So we are saying something that is very sane and it's obtainable, and we're going to take the steps to get there. Thank you.
I'll say on behalf of Circle Cinema, Linda, thank you so much for highlighting this film and letting us know that it existed. It was floating around, but I'm so glad that you were able to organize these phenomenal voices and allow us to have this conversation, allow us to be able to host something like this. So thank you, everyone. I think that concludes our conversation. I hope you enjoy the film. It'll still be on the Circle's website. So circlecinema.com, and you should still be able to find the Infiltrators for surely the next, as long as COVID is still a thing, it should still be on the website. So please check it out, tell your friends, and find these beautiful people and get connected with what they do. And again, tell more people about how to get connected and share this conversation in this film too. So with that, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you.